Coalesce podcast. My name's Grant.
And I'm Meg.
And we have the one and only Andrew Scott here joining us again to tell us about some of the brand new tenancy features that are in Coalesce. Thanks for joining us, Andrew.
Yeah, happy to be here.
And what we're going to talk about today is a lot of folks want to be able to have a Coalesce application that is available to many different kind of organizations, right? You may want to have something where when you log in, like the base way Coalesce works is you log in and it's just for kind of all the data is right out there and it's all kind of mixed together in your database and everybody can just get to all the data or based on your security. But one really common use case is I want to be able to segment that data into my organization, which may be different than Meg's, which may be different than Andrew's, and we can have different people as part of those organizations, and all of our data stays in our place. Now, you can do this with databases and with multiple apps, multiple deployments, but that gets expensive and gets hard to maintain pretty quickly. And so what we want to do is kind of build in some of that functionality so you can get some of that out of the box. And because we've had to build this a whole bunch of times here at Intelitech, we thought, let's take all those lessons learned and roll those into the templates so that when we start an app, we can just say, hey, start the app and use tenancy, or be able to make that tenant thing and then be able to backport some of that stuff into an app that already exists. So Andrew has spent the last several weeks kind of building this out and providing some really nice tenancy features. We went through, created a list of a bunch of stuff, and we've kind of implemented, I guess we call like V1 of that. So the way you get started with some of this tenancy is literally just to come to the Coalesce document pages and documentation pages and click Get Started. And just where you found the kind of the template project in the past, you now see some other things here for tenancy. And so what I'd like to do is kind of have Andrew just talk about, hey, what are these different options? What do they do? And then we're going to take some time to kind of get into the code and actually see kind of how some of this stuff works and how you can extend this to build tenancy into your application. So Andrew, here we see this new tenancy core. What is that doing for us?
Yeah, so that's going to bring along kind of the core infrastructure for supporting tenancy. So it's going to bring along, the database configuration, base classes and things like that, which are necessary to set up the data model correctly for this. It's going to kind of integrate with other features like the audit logging. So, the audit logs within a tenant can be secured and restricted only within that tenant. Other things like the user tracking base, then we kind of have a tenant base that builds on top of that as a kind of your default base class that you'll want to put all of your data that exists within your tenant on that base class. The next option we have, kind of the next three are around how tenants get created. So the first one is self-service, so that allows any user to come in and create a new tenant within your app. Kind of on the front-facing side of things, we've called the tenants organizations. Just probably how most users kind of think of that. You look at most applications that allow you to do that. You look at something like Azure DevOps, for example, allows you to create. Anybody can come in and just create a new Azure DevOps organization. So on the back end and kind of in the code, we call it a tenant, but in terms of user-facing language, we've settled on organization. It's probably a good default, but of course you can change that. The next one allows a global admin to create a tenant. So a global admin would essentially be like the owner of your application. So you, the person or business developing the application, would have the global admins, but nobody else is going to be a global admin. So this allows you essentially authority over all tenants to whatever extent you deem necessary. So ultimately, this global admin just becomes a role that can only be assigned by other global admins. So this is sort of a scenario where, maybe you have more of an enterprise grade application where you have a sales team that organizes a contract before you're going to create a tenant for a new customer.
Yeah, more of a white glove kind of service, right? Where this is really, hey, sign up, create my own thing. This is more like, hey, call us up, maybe pay us money, and we're going to build you a tenant or build your organization out. Is that a good example?
Yep, exactly.
And they can both be true at the same time, right? You can have both things possible too, so you can check them both.
Yep. So you notice on these, anytime you see a grayed out option here on the template options, you'll see at the very last line will tell you why that's grayed out and what it requires. So we see in this case, this requires the tenancy core, which we have, but it also requires one of these external sign-in options because that is indeed what it's based upon. So this is creation and automatic membership to a tenant by an external OIDC OpenID Connect provider. So by default, because we provide the Microsoft and Google options, we also then, this will integrate with those to automatically create a tenant per external organization that is signed in. So if you have a Microsoft Entra/Azure Active Directory organization, the first time somebody signs in from that organization, it's going to create them a new tenant. If other people from your organization within Microsoft Entra then also sign into the application, they'll be granted automatic membership to the tenant for that Microsoft AAD tenant. And similarly with Google, we base that on the G Suite domain. So if it is a domain that is configured in Google for Google G Suite, then we use the actual domain. So,
if I have
in
both,
our case, Intelitech.com becomes the origin of that external tenant.
Gotcha. So now if I have, like, for example, Intelitech.com both has an Azure Active Directory and a G Suite, do they become part of the same org, or are they separate orgs when those get created?
They'll be separate because there's no way to
know that they're the same.
To correlate those together. You could potentially come up with something custom within your application if you had a need, or maybe maybe the ability to merge a tenant or to some sort of verification or validation of the external provider.
So it's not
that's really a pretty advanced use case.
Got it. So it's not just by the domain; it's actually by the key that you hand back to.
Yeah. So for Google, it is by the domain because that's all they provide. For Microsoft, it's by the AAD tenant ID.
Tenant ID. Okay.
So
Gotcha.
the big old GUID for your tenant. And then the last one here is membership by invitation. So this allows the administrators within a tenant, so not the global admin, but just people within the tenant who are allowed to manage the users within that tenant, so manage their own permissions and such, will be able to create invite links that they can then send out to other people. Then that person can then click on the link, they'll be brought to the app, they'll be asked to sign in if they're not already signed in, and then they'll see a screen where they're allowed to accept the invitation to that tenant.
Fantastic. Let's go ahead. How do you feel about jumping into some code? Do you have some code up that maybe has some of these options checked? We can maybe walk through, we'll ask you some questions, and hopefully those are the same questions that the folks watching are having as well. So I think that'd be good. Thanks, sir.
So here I have a project with all of the tenancy options enabled. I just created. So kind of most of the interesting new stuff around tenancy is going to be in the web project, although we'll start at the data project since that's kind of where everything starts from. A significant amount of the configuration on the data side is in the DB context class. So we'll note first, right off the bat here, the DB context now is a tenant ID property on it. So this is used in an entity framework global query filter to restrict any queries that are being made throughout your application within any given HTTP request, so API call that comes into Coalesce. We'll grab the tenant ID for the current signed-in user and set it here on the DB context. And then that restricts all the operations that are happening against your DB context to be only within that tenant. So, and we'll see where that's configured down below. There is a method on here to force set the tenant if you, for some reason, need to use the same DB context against multiple tenants, which is kind of a, be careful. But this will do it by ensuring that the change tracker is cleared so that data doesn't again, it's not possible for data to get saved into the database in a way that is mixed. But if you were to change the tenant ID on the DB context while there's still other entities in the change tracker, you could end up performing an operation that reads a cached entity out of the change tracker that actually belongs to a different tenant. And so we just ensure that that can't happen with a few measures on here. To, essentially to make sure that that's always an explicit operation that you're deciding to do. Normally what you'd want to do is instantiate a new DB context through the IDB context factory, which is just a service provided by Entity Framework that you can inject any of your services. We provide some extension methods on that that allow you to create DB contexts for a specific tenant. So those over here in these extension methods, just simple create DB context for a specific tenant ID. So for example, if you had a background job that needs to operate on a number of different tenants' data, you would probably perform each tenant's operation in isolation, just in a loop, just loop over all your tenants, create a different DB context for each one. The bulk of the configuration is in the on model creating on your DB context. So now once it gets past some roles and permission stuff, we can see this pretty complicated set of configuration, but you should never need to mess with it. So this is dynamically attaching those global query filters to every one of your tenanted entities to make sure that all your queries are restricted to your current tenant. And then this is grabbing all of your tenanted entities that are marked by this iTenanted interface and inserting the tenant ID as the first part of each entity's primary key. So this is actually what prevents different tenants' data from ever being accidentally linked together. It becomes fully impossible for that to happen because the tenant ID is part of every primary key. It also becomes part of every foreign key between tenanted data. And so
And Andrew,
it truly
that
becomes
is
impossible at the database level for mistakes to happen.
And that really is you have to make sure that you add this idea of having a tenant ID to every one of your objects, right? Because if you don't do that, this isn't going to do that for you. You have to actually go ahead and implement that interface.
Yeah, and so what you would normally do is just inherit from this tenanted base class. This in turn inherits from the standard tracking base class, which is, well, if you enable that option in the template, which you can opt out of. So the tracking base puts a created by, modified by stamp on every entity. And then we continue that by putting the tenant ID on every entity. So for any entity that does exist within a tenant, it will either need to inherit from this tenanted base or otherwise implement this iTenanted interface, which you can see an example of how to implement this interface right here. So
and where that's helpful is it means that you can have some things that aren't tenanted. And just to be clear too, this is all the stuff that you get when you just do the tenancy core. That's the only package or the only
no, so I enabled all the options, but we haven't actually looked at anything that's brought in by the other options yet.
Yeah, so that's what I mean. We've only looked at the core stuff so far, just so people kind of know what we're looking at.
Yep. So, having non-tenanted entities is perfectly valid if you do have data that is kind of shared across your entire application that doesn't exist within your tenants. I'd say that's certainly a significant minority of what you'll be building. It's fairly uncommon. In the base template, we have, the tenant itself is not tenanted because it is the tenant. So
right.
It kind of doesn't work, chicken and egg and all that. And then the users are deliberately shared across all tenants. So a single user is granted access to 0 or more tenants by their membership in the tenant membership table. So this is actually what grants membership to tenants is a record existing in here. So the option to do invitations, that's what's adding records in here, and the membership by the external provider, that's also what's adding records in here.
Right? So effectively a many-to-many relationship between users and tenants.
Yep, exactly.
Good.
Right.
So speaking of the different ways that membership can happen, or membership can be assigned into a tenant rather. So from the options in the template, the first one we'll take a look at is the self-service tenant creation. So I elected to implement essentially kind of all the tenant management. Well, not quite all, but I suppose the kind of the user management within a tenant within just server-side Razor pages. The benefit of doing this is that you don't have to build your front-end view app in such a way that it's aware that a user might be signing into it without a tenant yet. Because in the self-service tenant creation scenario, you have a user signs into your app, but they don't actually yet belong to any tenants. They have to either create their initial own tenant, or in the case of invitations, they're signing into the app in order to accept an invitation, but they're not yet, until they accept that invitation, they're not yet part of a tenant. So those are implemented in these Razor pages in the web project. So this create tenant page, these are all very simple. We brought in Bootstrap just to add a little bit of styling because it's a little bit hard to bring in Vuetify into the Razor pages because Vuetify is a view framework. You could bring in Vuetify CSS, but that would be challenging, and so we just bring in Bootstrap through a CDN.
It's not quite worth it when you have Bootstrap.
Yep. Yeah. So really, really simple kind of basic styling to get you going with something that doesn't look hideous. And then you can go from there if you want to put your own branding and customization on these pages around managing the tenancy. All right, so now let's take a look at a actual project here. Sorry, the actual project we've been looking at, but let's actually run it. So I've got my VS Code in my browser open here. Let's do a .NET run. Just because I happen to already be in VS Code. Of course, you can always use your IDE of choice. So we'll go in here and pop into the app. Do note that I have actually added the client ID and client secret configuration to this application. You will need to do that. You will receive errors on startup that come from the authentication configuration. If you don't have the right, what was that?
Oh, that should, and then just be clear, that's just hooking it up to whatever you need to go register with Azure or Google.
Yep. Yeah, so that's just the sign in with Google, sign in with Microsoft configuration, independent of any tenancies. So just because we enabled both those options, you need to have that in there. So I'll go ahead and sign in here as myself. And see, I'm actually, why do I have a database? There's no migrations in here. Well, by some miracle, I seem to have a database. Oh, I know why. Because the configuration that I copied that had those client ID and client secrets also has an existing database. You would normally need to add migrations to your project. A brand new Coalesce project doesn't actually come with a database. I just happen to accidentally have one on my system already.
If everybody remembers episode 1 of the podcast, or if anybody has not watched episode 1, you should already know that. So hopefully this isn't surprising news when you hit that migration error if you're following along.
Yep. Just pretend we hit a migration error and we had to stop the app, go in and create our initial migration and come back in. So now, because I enabled all of those settings when we created the template, we can actually see here that I came straight into the app and we put the tenant name up here in the toolbar so you can just have a visual indicator of what tenant you're signed in. Obviously, you would want to add whatever branding is appropriate for your app up there, but just by default, we put the tenant name. So we can see we are in the Intelitech.com tenant, which is indeed what I signed in with through Microsoft. And so because I'm the first user to sign into this external organization, we can see here in the tenant and the admin, never mind this all tenants, the section which we'll get to, But here in the admin, I can see the organization settings. So the settings for this current tenant that I'm signed into. We can see that the external ID is indeed a Microsoft one, and this is indeed the tenant ID of the Intellitect organization. So anybody else, if they were somehow on my computer and able to access my local database, would also be granted access to this organization automatically when they sign in, if they're a member of that organization. So for the self-service tenant creation, if I go in here and I say switch organization, this is going to take me back out to one of those Razor pages. In this case, it's this select tenant page. I'm going to be able to see my existing organizations. We see, because I already have this database, we have one called QWERTY, or I can create a new one, which we'll take a look at first. So I can create an organization, and I can add in Freya's org. Freya's my cat who is sitting next to me. And now I have a new organization with this name, and we'll see again, I am an admin of this organization. It doesn't have an external ID. If I look at the users, I'll see only the users within this organization. From here, because I enabled the membership by invite option, I can open this invite user action. I can put in an email address, which is actually currently not used. The idea is what you should do here is email these links to people, because this is just the template and we don't have, at least not yet, an email provider provided out of the box. This cannot send emails, so you would need to wire that in yourself. This is just the standard method, standard Coalesce method. So we can type in an email, and we can optionally assign an initial role or not. And we can execute, and then that's going to generate a link. You can then take this link, and if we were to open this in a new tab that is not signed in, they'll be brought to the sign-in page. You'll see a little banner here saying that they've received an invite. You need to create an account to continue. So if I were to sign in with, oh, that doesn't work because my URL of this app, the port number doesn't match my existing configuration, which Google is picky about, but interestingly, Microsoft is not picky about.
Just sign in with another one.
So I don't actually have a different Microsoft account to use right here, but supposing that I did, and it wasn't my account that I already have that already has access to the app, then you would be able to join this tenant through any sign-in mechanism. Or if you were to add in local account authentication, which again will be coming at some point to the template, but we don't have it quite yet, then when you go to this invite link, you would have an additional option to create a new account with a username and password locally into the application. Or if you wanted to bring along some additional external sign-in provider, you can totally do that too. So that's how the invite links work. Continuing down the list, so we'd looked at self-service tenant creation. So on this page,
Global admins next.
Yep. So now we can, oh, and you can switch tenants in here. So any tenant that the user is a member of, you can switch between here. So we were in Freya's org, now we can switch to QWERTY. And now we were in the QWERTY organization. Creation by global admin. So because, again, I was the very first user ever across any tenant to sign into this application, I automatically got the global admin permission as the very, very first user. I can see this all tenants page. And so this allows me to just look at all the tenants. In a typical application, you would probably add a lot more properties of a tenant. You would maybe add some kind of branding information, configuration that is specific to that tenant, branding, theming, colors, logos, etc. That's kind of additional stuff that you'd probably add to the tenant table as you develop your application. But as a global admin, I can see all of these, and I can create a new one. So if I made a new org called test, and once again, the email here, again, there's not email sending, but this will just create an invite link for this user to become the initial user of that tenant. So I create this, you see it created my test tenant, and now I have an invite link that will grant a user membership as the initial admin to this test tenant. So, if you were a first party organization creating new tenants for people, you might actually make yourself the initial user of that tenant as you kind of get it set up for the customer. And then at some point in the future, you could then remove yourself or diminish your permissions or leave yourself in there as a super admin, just depending on kind of what that relationship and what that arrangement looks like. Or you could just give this straight to the customer, and you as an admin, as a global admin, would never actually be a member of that tenant. It's really up to you. It's kind of, whatever workflow makes sense for the application that you're building.
Cool. Yeah, and I think that this covers most of the things that you'd really want to be doing with tenancy. So I think we covered the creation by self-service, creation by global admin, the membership, invitation, and do we have any other ones?
No other options in the template. We can kind of briefly look through some of the other files that we didn't look at. So, here in the Razor pages, create tenant, we looked at the page to accept the invitation. We actually didn't look at, but it's pretty simple. It looks like the other ones. It just has a button to either accept the invitation, switch to a different account, so it'll display your current username, so you can verify that you're joining the tenant as the user that you mean to join. If you somehow have multiple accounts within the application, then you can make sure that you're picking the right one. You can decline the invitation, which just sends you to the home page. Don't know why you would do that, but
a quick note too for people who haven't used Razor pages. The way this works is you've got this kind of HTML mixed with C# page, and then it has a backing page. It's got a CS HTML page kind of .cs that backs it, and that's where all that logic is. If people are wondering like how the heck is this doing anything, if you're used to front end code.
Yep, absolutely. So we just have super basic forms. This is doing a form post back to this page, which we can see here in the onPost method. We decode the invitation, which includes, so the invitations are actually encrypted string, encrypted with the ASP.NET Core data protection. So this link, if anybody has this link, it's good for 24 hours. They can accept membership into the application. If you need to do something within your application to track invites individually, you could add an invitations table and encode the invitation ID within this invitation object, which we can see the type of is here, this user invitation object. It just has a couple properties on it. If you needed to be more strict about that, you can layer that in here on the template. Keep track of those. Maybe make the invitation single redemption only.
Great.
Yeah.
I think that covers kind of all the tenancy stuff, at least at a very high level. I mean, definitely go in, pull the template down, play with it, look around. Is there anything else that we want to kind of go over real quick?
Yeah, just to breeze through some of the configuration here. So this will be pretty similar to kind of what you get out of the box for Google and Microsoft external sign-in providers. But we'll note here the thing that's going to be different here is first on this configure application cookie configuration. This is the point at which the tenant ID gets set on the DB context for each request. This is essentially the earliest possible spot in the authentication pipeline that the tenant ID can be grabbed. So this is This is just after the user gets pulled out of the authentication cookie, is the point that we set this on the tenant, so that anything else within the current HTTP request, including the validation of the security stamp, for example, which happens every 5 minutes, to verify that the user hasn't been, for example, kicked out of the tenant that they are trying to access. This allows that to be available to everything else. Here in the sign-in service, there's a pretty good degree of extra code here for if you've chosen the creation membership by OIDC option. This is where we grab the G Suite domain if you're signed in with Google, or the tenant ID if you're signed in with Microsoft. And then we use that to determine your external tenant. So this will look for an existing tenant with that ID, create it if it doesn't exist, seed it initially if it doesn't exist, grant membership to it if the user is not already a membership of that external organization. Back here in the data project, just a little bit, we see here in the claims principal factory, which again, you'll get even if you just include baseline ASP.NET Core identity with no external sign-in of any kind. There's a pretty good amount of extra stuff in here around determining the claims that are specific to a tenant. So we see we come in, we assume that the tenant ID will already be set on the DB context, again, through that setup in the authentication configuration and the onValidate principle. So that's where that comes from. We then go look at that tenant. If it isn't there, this means it's a user who maybe hasn't selected a current tenant or doesn't even belong to a tenant. In this case, if they do a membership in some tenant, then we'll just pick the first one so they don't end up in kind of a state where they're not in any tenant when they first sign in. This is really only applicable to the path of not using external membership from OIDC. So if you use local account authentication, then once somebody signs in with their username and password, you have to pick which tenant they initially sign into. By default, this is picking the oldest tenant membership for that user. But if you wanted to maybe create something else, preferences for the user to say, hey, this is my default tenant. This is the one I want to sign into automatically. You could build that into your application and set that up right here. Otherwise, if they did come in with a tenant ID, then we go down this path and we just super double check that they are indeed a member of the tenant that came in on that on the DB context, which again we pulled out of their claims, which come from their authentication cookie. So this is applicable when the cookie is being refreshed. If the user was previously a member of that tenant, but then 5 minutes later they get evicted from that tenant, then we force them out of that tenant and essentially sign into the null tenant ID, which is just the empty GUID. And that prevents any data from getting associated to a tenant that user isn't actually a member of, and it prevents them from querying any actual tenant. So this essentially allows a signed-in user to access these Razor pages without being able to do any actions against any of the Coalesce APIs that are going against tenanted data. For example, this widget table is tenanted. And so that's really it in here. There's a little security check around making sure that the global admin, somebody didn't somehow manage to elevate themselves to global admin without actually being marked as a global admin. Which you'll see here is a setting on the user page, which is something that's a little bit new to the Coalesce template as well. We put in a kind of a default custom page for managing a user because most apps are going to need something like that. Because I am a global admin, I can see the setting, but only global admins can see the setting, and only global admins can change the setting for anyone else. And you can't remove it from yourself because you could brick your tenant if you did that.
Yeah,
or rather,
sense.
you could brick your application if you did that. You'd have to go into your database and manually reassign it to somebody.
Yeah.
So yeah, a lot of stuff. I think that's actually it. In terms of kind of going through the major changes to the authentication and other kind of infrastructure stuff in the app. So the way that you build entities within your tenant, like for example the widget example entity, super simple. You just make sure to inherit from the tenanted base or otherwise implement the iTenanted interface, and that's really all you have to do. So in terms of the day-to-day development of your application, you really don't ever have to think about the tenancy model because it's all really strongly enforced by that configuration in Entity Framework and kind of the rest of the infrastructure stuff within the application.
Yeah, which is super nice, and it kind of plays into just the niceties that Coalesce does for you behind the scenes. It kind of all just works as long as you follow the rules. So.
Yep. No foot guns lying around for, you write an entity and you forget to make a data source that filters it to the current tenant. It's all strongly enforced that it's really pretty difficult to make a mistake.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. Well, I think that's it. So yeah. Until next time then, I guess. Thank you so much for coming on and explaining all that.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me.
Yep.
All
right. Thanks.
See ya.
Thanks all.